It was just,
Yeah.
they had kind of chewed up my front yard putting it in. And so after about 6 months, I decided, well, we needed new phones and we could just bundle it all together. So
Hmm.
I went ahead and went for it. And then the COVID pandemic hit, and I'm like, oh, I need all this bandwidth now. So
Yeah.
anyway, so you go by Blair?
Yes. Oh yeah, that's how I found out last night that our internet was down, was I tried turning in that.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to clean up the WordPress site to get it ready for you guys.
So will we be using that today?
I want to get old posts cleared out before we start adding new stuff. When I got rid of the old users, I thought it was going to
Get rid of the posts.
get rid of the post, but evidently it didn't. So I'm going through and having to hand delete all of them one by one. And because, I require you to post X number of times, etc., it's just a little time consuming. But I put up the prompts for the next 2 weeks, so they're on the Moodle site.
Okay.
I did that this morning, but we'll get to that when everybody is here.
Okay.
Jackson, do you go by Jackson or Jack?
Jackson.
Okay, cool. Branson, you on?
I am, yes.
Yeah, you go by Branson?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Winston, Mackenzie, Olivia. We've still got just a couple of minutes waiting for everybody else. How are you guys hanging so far?
Good.
Everything going okay?
Yeah, pretty good.
So you guys are all been here at Jewel for a little while. Does this seem weird, or did you guys get accustomed to this last spring?
A little bit of both, probably.
Okay.
I was not here last spring. I was taking a leave, and so this is all new for me.
Okay. The food blogging stuff is stuff that we've done in past semesters. So it's not something that's new for this new digital way of going about things. But one of the things that I like about it is I think it helps everybody get to know everyone to a certain degree. So that's one of the nice things about it. Plus, it also gives us another way of talking about food rather than just what we do in class. So that's another part of it. I'm always surprised at how much I end up learning about you guys from both the food blog and the food journals over time. And then I also learn things about like broader culture. So I don't eat a lot of fast food, and I don't have a TV. So I was not aware of the Subway $5 footlong thing that they did a number of years ago. But the students in their food journals, all of a sudden, everybody was eating at Subway. And so after that week of food journals, I went to the class. I'm like, okay, what is up with Subway? And they're like, $5 footlongs. Don't you know about this? I'm like, no, I had no idea. So I learned all sorts of things from reading your food journals. I'm getting a bunch of emails all of a sudden. I'm wondering if people are having trouble logging in. Let me go check that. No, okay, all right. Close that so that stops going off. All right. Blake is here. Jackson, Branson, Wilson, McKinsey, Olivia, Marcus, Kenton. All right. Two things we want to do today. I want to do today. The first thing I want to do is give you some insight into why I would teach a class like this. Because the Ecology of Food, a lot of you said yes on Wednesday, like you're not even sure what the class is about. And so I want to give you some ideas as to why I put this class together. And then the other thing that I want to do today is I want to talk kind of about how scientists think and operate, but I want to do that in the context of kind of real world issues, which is why I had you guys listen to that news article from NPR. So hopefully you got to do that between yesterday and today. So I'm going to tell you a story, and it might go on longer than you want, but I have visuals to go with it, so hopefully it won't be too boring. So I'm going to share my screen, and let's see if I can do this successfully. Yeah, okay. So everybody, can you guys see? Oh gosh, come on now. Yeah. Can you see the Ecology of Food screen? Was that a no?
Yeah,
It's
no,
still on you.
it's still
Oh, it's still on me. Oh, because I didn't click the share button. Ah, there we go. Okay,
Hey.
how about now?
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay, let me go. Can you see the notes and stuff like that on there? Is that what's that's doing?
No, we can't see the notes.
All right, what happened? All right, what can you see? What can you see right now?
Just
Right
the
now.
PowerPoint.
A PowerPoint that's just hanging out up there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, so let's do this. All right. Right, now you should only see the slide itself, right? Okay, cool.
Yes.
All right. So I've already asked you to do this. I've gotten this from some of you. If you hadn't done this yet, but basically fill out this information and answer these questions. Is once again just help me get to know you a little bit. One of the things that we're going to be doing occasionally in the class is responding to news that comes out. We happen to hold this class every year during harvest season. And so one of the things that I typically do in the morning as I'm getting ready for school is I listen to farm reports. I realize that sounds like a very strange thing to do, but sometimes I'll come in at the beginning of class and begin class with something that I heard in the farm news that day, because this is the time of year when crops are coming in, food prices begin, commodity prices begin to fluctuate and things like this, and sometimes there are interesting things to talk about from the news. So during the fall, my radio listening habits change a little bit because of this class, because I tune into radio stations that I don't normally listen to, and they're stations that carry local farm news. So I'm interested in where you get your news as well, because that's going to be a part of the class to a certain degree. So in 2006, I took a bicycle ride. And so I started out in Kansas City, and I took a train from Omaha to Portland, and then I rode from Portland to Astoria, Oregon, over here on the Oregon coast. And then I began bicycling my way back to St. Louis, following as closely as I could the Lewis and Clark Trail, and I took the wandering path that they took on their way going west. And then when I got to Montana, there's no way to get down to the river except going down to the river and coming back. So I went along a highway that just kind of goes across in a straight line across Montana. And then roads follow the river pretty much after that. And my goal was to end up in St. Louis on the 200th anniversary of the return of Lewis and Clark, which was in September of 2006. And I did this simply because I was on sabbatical. I hadn't had a vacation in over a decade, and I am into bicycling. And so that's about 3,200 miles. It took me 6 weeks to do it. And I rode about 85 miles a day. And this is what I looked at the beginning. There's me at Fort Clatsop on the Pacific coast, where Lewis and Clark spent their second winter. You can see that I have a little bit of a beer belly there, and I will, over the next 6 weeks, lose 15 pounds. And I went up the Columbia River Gorge. It was very beautiful. And as I got into eastern Washington, I began to see these forests that were on the tops of the ridges that border the Columbia River. And I discovered a few days ago that these were apple orchards. And so when you buy Washington apples, this is where they're coming from. As I pushed even further into eastern Washington, I came up out of the river gorge one day, and all of a sudden there were just carrots all over the road. Evidently they were harvesting carrots. Once again, this was in the late summer, early fall, so it was harvest season for many crops. And they put them in the back of trucks, and as the trucks went down the road, the carrots blew out, and there were just carrots scattered all over the road. I got into even further western Washington. This is around Walla Walla, and I found myself down in this valley, and I was just surrounded by hillsides of wheat. And the wheat was so prodigious that if you looked at the shoulder, where you would normally see weeds coming up through the pavement and asphalt, all you could really see was wheat seeds and occasional little spots of asphalt. Once again, the wheat was loaded up in trucks, being taken to the granary, and then blowing out of the back of trucks. I saw Native American battlefield sites. I saw the effects of grazing. This is a pasture on the right-hand side that is heavily grazed. The pasture on the left is not grazed at all, and you can see the difference that grazing has on plant communities. When I was in Twin Bridges, Montana, I stumbled across this weekly calf roping competition that people have, where people sometimes drive 100 miles because Twin Bridges is the nearest town to them, and they meet up on a Wednesday night every week, and they do rodeo practice. But what I discovered as I hung out there that night is that it's really just an opportunity for people to gather together and chat with one another and reconnect, because very few people were doing this, and tons of people were just sitting around their horses talking to one another for like hours that night. Just all kinds of unusual things that I saw as I went. Once again, a bunch of wheat fields in Montana. This is, of course, why they refer to that as the Big Sky Country. I saw the homesteads, the old homesteads of people. This is a log cabin with a sod roof that dates to the late 1800s. Saw native wildlife, bison, that people are now growing for meat. And this is in Alexander, North Dakota. As I pulled into Alexander, North Dakota, I camped in the public park. Strangely enough, in a lot of these small towns throughout the West, you're allowed to camp overnight in the public park, which was good for me because I could always find a place to camp. And while I was at dinner, I came back, and these Mandan Indians were erecting their teepees because I happened to roll into town on their annual Founders Day celebration. And so they asked me to move my tent because my tent was where they wanted to pitch their teepees. And then I actually hung out with some Mandan Indians for the evening. They were due to do some ceremonial dance presentations the next day. Mandan Earth Lodges. So this is where Mandan Indians lived before European settlers came through and displaced them. I saw a ton of corn and I saw a ton of soybeans as I was going through all of this. And there came a point in South Dakota when I was talking to a friend of mine back here in Liberty, and she was like, "What have you seen?" And I was probably 1,500 miles, 1,600 miles into the ride at that point. And I started thinking about what I had seen up to this point. And I realized that all but about 13 miles of the 15 to 1,600 miles I had ridden at that point was some form of agriculture, whether it was wheat fields or apple orchards, carrot fields, cornfields, soybean fields. There was the green bean day. So I had a carrot day where I rode through green carrots. There was another day where I rode through green beans. I didn't have this in the presentation. There's one town, once again in eastern Washington, they have carved into the side of a hill an image of the Jolly Green Giant, of the, I guess it's Del Monte's icon for their beans. And I realized at that point that I had just ridden through nothing but agriculture. In some cases it was forests, but they were all forests that were run by the National Forest Service. And so they were all forests that were being grown for wood production or wood pulp production. So even the forests that I had been through were some form of agriculture. And for some reason, my office is really hot today. So I am sweating while I do this. So when I figured out that I had basically spent most of my time riding my bicycle through agricultural landscapes, I figured out, well, maybe I should kind of think about this more deeply and think about how much of our landscape has been converted from a natural landscape into an agrarian landscape. And then I started thinking about the environmental science class that I was currently teaching as part of the CTI program, and decided that I would change the focus of that to focus on food. And so that's where this came from. When I got back, I talked to some people, they heard that I was planning on doing this. They were like, "Oh, you should read this new book by Michael Pollan that just came out." And so I picked up The Omnivore's Dilemma. And after that, I was just kind of off and running. One of the things that I did with my sabbatical that year is I actually put together the course proposal and got this course approved. And so then in 2007, I taught the ecology of food for the first time. So that's kind of where this came from. Do you have any questions about any of that? All right, so we're going to talk about food, how it's grown, the economics of the food, the history of the United States and how that's influenced how we go about producing food and all of that. And so what I asked you to do for today was to listen to this NPR article that was from last year, and it was during a time when the US government was involved with a trade war with China. And so here at the beginning, just unmute yourselves, everybody unmute, and who can tell me kind of what the gist of that news article was?
It was kind of just about how most farmers nowadays, their profit is in China. That like they sell a lot of corn and soy there,
Yep.
and because of this trade deal, that's not happening.
Well,
And
actually,
so
it's because of the lack of a trade deal in reality.
Well, because of trade war.
Yeah.
Because of the trade war, that wasn't happening, and so they were losing out on a lot of profit. It also kind of talked about why they don't rotate crops, or why they don't just switch different things.
Yeah, the market is not good for soybeans now, so why don't you just grow green beans or something else? So what's the nature, somebody else, what's the nature of the trade war? How do trade wars get fought, in a sense?
Tariffs and like through tariffs and sanctions.
Okay, so somebody else tell me what a tariff is.
Isn't it just like a tax on imported goods?
It is. That's exactly what a tariff is. So when an importer imports a good, the government of the country that it's being imported to will place a tax on that imported good. And so what happened during the trade war with China is we put tariffs on a bunch of their products, and as a result, the Chinese government put a bunch of tariffs on our goods. And one of the first sets of tariffs that China imposed on American goods was, of course, what?
Soy.
Soybeans, agricultural tariffs. And so China is a huge market for soy for American farmers. And of course, the Chinese government wanted to hurt farmers first. Why? Why do you think China would want to hurt farmers?
Because they know they have a surplus of crops.
So that could be part of it, but there's a more political reason why they might want to target farmers.
Without farmers, nobody could eat.
Sorry, what's that?
Without farmers, nobody could eat.
That's probably not it either. Once again, there's a much more political agenda going on. Who instigated this trade conflict with China? Kind of got the ball rolling. You guys are very quiet now.
I have no idea.
Jackson, you have any idea?
You said who started the trade war?
Yeah,
China?
Yeah.
Was it America?
It was America. It was Trump in particular. Trump has been gunning for China even before he was elected. So why would the Chinese government want to target farmers?
Trump's base.
It's Trump's base. They want to hurt Trump's base. They want to turn farmers against Trump because they think Trump is bad for business because of this trade war. So in the article, you probably heard some people talking about the relationship between Trump and the trade war and the tariffs, and they're not super happy with Trump. They weren't at this particular time because the market has dried up for those goods, as the market dries up for those goods, what happens to the price of those goods?
They go up.
When you have a surplus of something, does
Or
that
no,
tend
they
to-
go down.
They go down. Who was that?
Me, Blair.
Blair? Okay. So whenever you have, we'll talk about laws of supply and demand later on in the semester, but generally the more of something you have, the cheaper it is because you have supply that far outstrips demand. And so you can't charge as much for it because it's not particularly in demand. So we'll talk about the specifics of that when we get to a section on economics. So farmers have all these soybeans. They can't sell them anywhere because China was the main consumer of their crop. And as a result, the price of soybeans was dropping. And so when we think about things in a scientific way, we can listen to this news program and say, oh, you know, the plight of farmers is terrible because of this trade war. These tariffs have dried up the market for soybeans, and as a result, there's been this precipitous drop in the price of soy. So I'm going to once again share my screen, and I'm going to try and share my screen. I happen to Zoom has done weird things to my computer screen. All right, thank you. Now it is giving me back my screen. All right. So I'm going to once again technical difficulties. All right. Once again, attempting to share the screen. All right, so here's kind of the big question, the big picture question. Can you see the PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So here's the question. Do tariffs on China affect the price of farm commodities? So my first question to you is, if you were interested in answering this question, where might you want to find some information that gives us this?
You could find some sort of a graph across time to see the price of commodity, like price spikes based on when tariffs have been implemented.
So what would be a good trusted source for that information, do you think?
You think the stock market would tell us anything?
Stock market probably wouldn't, because that basically looks at the price of stocks, and this is technically a commodity. And do you guys know what a commodity is?
That'd be like any of the goods, like the corn or soybeans. Would those be the commodities?
Yeah, so corn and soybean are commodities, but they're kind of unusual commodities. Traditionally, commodities were things like steel and coal and things like this. Commodities are things that you buy and sell that can undergo long-term storage. And so dried food, grains and beans and things like that, act as commodities because you can always save them to sell them at a later date, in the same way that you could hold back steel from the steel market or coal from the coal market or something like that. So you wouldn't necessarily find this from stock exchange. Where else might you be able to find information like that?
Could you look at like the Department of Agriculture?
That is exactly where you should go and look. Go and find data that are published on the Department of Agriculture, because that's a federal agency that is in charge of kind of following and tracking agriculture in the United States. They track prices, they track productivity, et cetera, et cetera. because it's a federal government database and they basically just receive reports from local jurisdictions on what farmers are producing and what prices they're getting for their crops. And because it's a nonpartisan sort of agency, their goal really is to get the best information that they can to policymakers. It's usually pretty reliable. And so, of course, as a scientist, I said, okay, well, if this is our hypothesis, tariffs on goods to China affect farm commodity prices here in the United States. If that's our hypothesis, we should expect to see farm prices, the price of commodities, fall during this time when tariffs were imposed. And so we could go to the US Department of Agriculture's website and actually just find a graph of farm prices. And what I've given you here is a line. The black line represents the date that Donald Trump first announced that he was going to be imposing tariffs on China. Red is the line that represents the date when those tariffs actually went into effect. And of course, what can you see in this narrow window of time?
A decline.
What's that, Jackson?
A decline.
Yeah, you see a precipitous decline in the price of soybeans, not so much affecting corn prices. I've given you corn here as a comparison. And then they kind of stay depressed until the middle of the summer of 2019. So if I showed you this graph, there is the question that we had on the slide before, which is, do tariffs on China affect the price of farm commodities? What would you say the answer is?
I mean, if the black line is when it's announced and the red line is when it's actually implemented, it seems more like it's the prediction of a tariff than the tariff itself that's doing
Yeah. That's a good
affecting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So what's accounting for that decline before the tariffs actually go into effect?
Market confidence, like consumer confidence.
So part of it could be consumer confidence, but these are big corporations making decisions, and it's China making decisions. What did the Chinese government start doing during that time in late March and April up until June of 2018?
Imposing counter tariffs.
They didn't do that. If you know that you are going to start putting tariffs on soybeans when the United States starts putting tariffs on your goods, what do you probably start doing?
Making your own.
Well, if they could grow their own, they wouldn't be relying so much on US soybeans.
Oh, trying to find other sources to import.
They start finding other sources of soybeans to import from. So this decline here represents China preparing for the onset of tariffs when they know that their goods are going to be taxed by the United States, and they're going to start taxing soybeans. Because when they start taxing soybeans that are being imported to China from the United States, what does that start doing to food prices in China?
They'll go up.
Yeah, food prices go up because there's this added tax to those soybeans. And so during this time, China starts looking for other external markets to buy soybeans from. And that basically leads to a decline in the price of soybeans in the United States. And then that price stays depressed after the tariffs go into effect. So the threat of tariffs led to the decline, and then the onset of tariffs made that decline a real long-term sort of state. But this is, what's one of the problems with the data that I've shown you in this figure?
Is it the corn?
No, corn is just there to help you have another reference.
The fact that it's not the only example of decline?
Okay, what do you mean by that? Who's that?
Blair?
Is that Blair? Okay, Blair.
Basically that there's basically a gradual trend
So
of decline? Like it just kind of looks like another bump.
Here in 2014, there's a huge price increase. Then that declines kind of down to this baseline. And then it kind of stays in this area of, you know, $8 to $12 per bushel until the tariffs, when it kind of drops down more in the $8 to $9 per bushel range. And so the point of one of the things that you see in this figure is that prices of commodities fluctuate a lot. Tariffs certainly have a role to play because you can identify this is when tariff talks started happening. We saw the decline and the decline went down, but only went down about $2 per bushel, whereas this decline here is actually a decline of, it's up around 15 and it declines to around 9. So that's like a $6 a bushel decline during that time period. What kind of thing might cause commodity prices to go up that high?
Could it be that the only thing I can think of is that like something came out saying that soybeans are good for X or something, and so a lot of people started buying them.
Okay, so one of the things that can raise the price of something is that demand can go up. Demand goes up while supply stays the same, but because of that increased demand with a constant supply, price goes up because there's more demand on the constant supply. But demand isn't the only thing that can happen. What else can change? Somebody else other than Blair.
If supply goes down.
Okay, who's that? Oh, Mary. Okay, cool. If supply goes down, what does that do to price?
It'll push it up because it's harder to get.
Because it's harder to get. What kinds of things can make the supply of soybeans go down?
If it's like a bad season for it, like it's really hard to grow them that year or something.
Okay, so what kinds of things affect that? What would one of those examples be?
Maybe
Here in the Midwest. What's that?
if
Weather.
there's like,
Let Mary talk.
if there's just like a lot of bad weather, either like too much rain or not enough rain, kind of a thing.
Okay, all right. So we'll get to weather here in a few minutes. What else is a problem with this graph? What range of dates does the x-axis cover?
14, like beginning of 2014 to what's that? Maybe July 2019.
Yeah, so it covers about a 4.5-year span. Do we have more data on soybean prices than this?
Probably.
Oh yeah, we do. So I've framed this within the really narrow context of just a relatively few number of years. I could have made it look like a huge decline if I had just concentrated on this band of time right here. So whenever you look at a graph, think about, well, what span of time is that graph actually telling me? Why did the presenter of that graph choose that time frame? So Mary brings up an important point. In 2012, we were in the middle of a multi-year drought. This is the drought map from August 21st of 2012. It was bad all throughout the Midwest, which is the major corn and soybean producing area of the United States. And as you can see, that there was a climb in the price of soybeans at the same time that there was a climb in the price of soy. Now, if we look at a broader time frame than the time frame that we were just looking at, we can see the effect of that drought during this time period. It was a multi-year drought and it really drove up prices. And let's see. And I've shown you in shades here periods of other major droughts that have occurred. So this now is data that goes back to the late 1960s. So this is now a decadal track of this. And so take a couple of minutes and look at this figure and tell me some other things that you notice. So essentially, this decline that was imposed by the trade war with China is this little decline right here at the very end of this time lapse, this timeline of price. And when the government reports prices, they adjust all these prices to account for inflation. So this would be the price of things in 2019 dollars projected back over time. Just jump in whenever you want to with any kind of insights you have.
Something I'm noticing is that during that period, the prices dropped as low as they did since what looks to be corresponding about with where the recession is in 2008.
Yeah, so when you look in 2009, prices dropped a lot. But even before then, we have soybean prices that are much lower than even the prices during the recession and much lower than the prices during this current trade war spat. What else do you notice?
Corn basically has the same pattern with soybeans. It's just a little bit less price, but I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, so you notice that when soybeans start to go up, corn also goes up, which points to what happening? What's the main factor probably then in driving commodity prices, agricultural commodity prices?
Grow conditions.
Growing conditions, sure. And those growth conditions, whether in most cases drought, although last year it would have been too much rain, actually was negatively affecting growing conditions and led to increases in the price of agricultural commodities. But the abiotic factors of the environment that affect the plant growth actually is what has a much greater effect on agricultural prices than trade wars actually do. The blip due to trade conflict is that much. That's not nearly the amount of fluctuation in prices that has been the result of things like periodic droughts, and multi-year droughts affect prices much more than shorter period droughts do. So when we go back to this question at the beginning, which is, do tariffs on China affect the price of farm commodities? What would the answer be after having looked at some data?
Yes, but it's not the main factor.
That's a really nice, nuanced answer. Yes, it does affect them, but does it affect them as much as other things? Probably not. Well, how do we know that? Well, because we went and we looked at some data that on price, and we looked at other data, for example, on droughts. As it turns out, there's a Wikipedia page about major droughts in the US. You can go and log on and you can get a historical record of all of the major droughts going back to the beginning of the 1900s, where they basically say, kind of what droughts occurred when, where in the United States they occurred, and kind of how severe they were. And that's where I pulled this drought information from. The lines are from the U.S. Department of Agriculture's pricing, the part of the USDA that tracks price. And then these are just historical records of when major droughts occurred. The corn spike in 2008 was due to two things happening: a drought that occurred right before 2008, and then fuel standards that were passed in the Obama administration that encouraged, well, it actually didn't encourage, it required companies to blend more ethanol into gasoline, led to increases in demand that came at the same time that prices were already increasing due to a drought the previous 2 years. And that led to a precipitous spike in corn. I don't know if you guys remember this back in 2000 and 2008, but meat prices went way up because of commodity corn prices going way up. And that was because of the confluence of these two factors, a drought that reduced the supply of corn and fuel economy standards that forced petroleum companies to blend more ethanol into gasoline, which then increased demand. As you have a decreased supply, and increased demand simultaneously, you get a big spike in price. And while corn prices are much less fluctuating than soybean prices, that still represents a pretty big spike, equivalent to a multi-year drought spike. So what a scientist does is they start with a question. They ask themselves, well, what kind of data would I need to either generate myself, if you're an experimental scientist, or if you're an economist. An economist in some ways is sort of a scientist as well. What kind of data do I need to gather or have available to me to shed light on that question? If the hypothesis is true, what would I expect the trend to be in those data? You know, if tariffs do decrease the price of commodities, then I would expect where tariff activity is high, that the commodity prices would decline. Now, do those data that we gather, are they consistent with that hypothesis or are they not? What was that? Somebody said something? No, okay. So are they consistent or are they not? And if they're not consistent, well, then what other things are that we're not thinking about might be responsible for showing those patterns? And this is actually a place where scientists oftentimes trip themselves up. When a scientist thinks about a particular question, they oftentimes only come up with one proposed answer to that question. But oftentimes there are multiple competing answers as the answer to that question, and we sometimes get tunneled in on the one answer that we think is the right one, but might not be the right one. And so entertaining as many alternative answers as we can leads us to doing what Mary did, which was saying, okay, well, what other things might be accounting for this? Well, maybe it's something that doesn't have to do with tariffs at all. Maybe it has to do with the growing conditions of the commodity that is being sold. Then we can go back to the data and say, okay, does this new hypothesis, the hypothesis that weather affects price as much as anything else, is that consistent with the data? And then we go and look at the data and we're like, oh yeah, we see price spikes, you know, during and after and shortly after drought events. That probably explains more of the variation in price than tariffs and trade wars do. So do the farmers have a beef? They do have a beef, but it's a kind of tiny beef. It's just, can you guys see my pointer? It's just this much of a beef. With the trade war, much bigger fluctuations happening in the past, and soybeans have been much cheaper in the past than they are currently. So on this front, and just so you know what my politics are, so that you can frame everything that I say by knowing what my mindset is, I would want nothing more than to side with the farmers on this and say that Trump is a terrible human being for engaging in this trade war. But on this front, I really can't do that. And the reason that I can't do that is because my science informs my politics. You can be mad at Trump for all kinds of things, but you can't be that mad at Trump for a trade war negatively affecting farmers. Farmers have had it much worse in the past, and his trade war has led to a relatively small decline in the price of agricultural commodities.
I mean,
lower in the past, and the fluctuations have been higher. Yeah, Blair.
They might. The only thing I can think of why they would be more upset, even though it's not as much of a drop, is that this is like man-made. Like there's only so much you can do about droughts.
Sure, that's a valid point. There is only so much you can do about droughts. That's true. Yeah. So one of their beefs might be, well, this was an unavoidable decline in price. I'm sorry, this was an avoidable decline in price, whereas drought is an unavoidable thing that pushes up drought. We'll talk about the negative and positive consequences of droughts. So we see these high prices for soybeans during this drought period, but think about for a minute, what does that really mean for a farmer? So now all of a sudden you're selling your soybeans for $15 a bushel. What do you think the consequence of that is to the average farmer?
A
a lot of times if there's a shortage and so they're selling at $15 a bushel, they're having to take their storage as well. So like whatever they're saving, just in case for those bad years, they're having to take from the storage as well as the crops they had that year.
Okay, so if you've been storing crops, you're actually pretty smart, because at this point, you can take a crop that you would have sold at a lower price last year, and you can dump that onto the market and sell it at a much higher price now. But most farmers don't store their commodities from year to year unless the price gets really, really low. And they mentioned this in the news article. This one farmer had a lot of storage capacity, and so he was just going to stockpile his soybeans this year and hope that the price goes up further down the line. If this price is being driven by supply being low, while you may be getting $15 a bushel for your soybeans, how many bushels of soybeans do you have to sell?
Not as many.
You have not as many bushels to sell. So even though the price is high per bushel, if the drought has really cut into the number of bushels that you have to sell, you're probably not making any more money than you did if you had a good year and the price of your commodity is really low. This is actually one of the kind of fallacies that I want you guys to know about. Can you guys see the board behind me?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna use the board periodically, and I'm gonna try and write big enough. We can talk about good years and bad years in agriculture. What would a good year typically be?
Lower prices, but more sales.
So you have a big crop, the weather was just right, the insects didn't come and destroy your crop. You have a lot of stuff to sell because you had a good year. Your farm was really productive. But if your farm is really productive, the guy who has 1,500 acres next door, what's his year like?
Better.
He's having a good year also. And George on the other side of the valley,
It is good too.
he's having a good year also. So when everybody's having a good year, everybody's producing a lot. So supply goes up. And what does that do to price?
Lowers.
Price goes down. So you have a lot to sell, but it's at a much lower price than it could be, which from the standpoint of your profit, this low price eats into whatever profit you were hoping to gain on that crop. And so a good year for a farmer in terms of productivity is not necessarily a good year economically, because there's all of this product on the market and you don't get a very good price for all of that grain or all of that soybean that you have to sell. In a bad year, what is a bad year for a farmer?
Drought, insects eating stuff, not as many sales, higher prices.
Yeah, so you have floods, you have droughts, whatever it is, it drives down supply, which drives up price. But you would normally think that driving up price is a good thing, but now you're selling a commodity at a higher price, but you have way less of that commodity to sell. The end point of that as a farmer is that you're not making as much money as you could. And so when we think about good years and bad years in agriculture, good years and bad years on the end of the year balance sheet for a farmer, they don't really look very different from one another because of the way in which prices for commodities fluctuate. And they are one of the kinds of products that responds very true to form to David Ricardo's law of supply and demand from economics. And so one of the things that I learned as I started teaching this class about farm economics is that it's just kind of hard to be a farmer anytime. You're running really narrow margins and it doesn't take much to tip you into the red, because a good year isn't necessarily a good year and a bad year isn't really much different from a good year from a farming perspective. after I started delving into this, I began asking myself why anybody would ever want to go into farming. We'll discuss trends in farming employment later in the semester, and we'll find that people don't want to go into farming in the 21st century, which is why less than 2% of the American populace is involved in the enterprise of agriculture, commercial agriculture. It's a really tiny sliver of the population that provides all of the food that we eat, which is amazing. So, scientist has a question, gets some data, asks if the data are consistent with the proposed answer to the question. If it's consistent, then we think that that proposed answer has validity. If it's not consistent, we know that that is not the right answer, and we have to go looking for alternative answers. And we start proposing alternative answers until we find a set of answers that are consistent with the data. And you can apply this as an experimental scientist doing animal behavior research, which is kind of what I do. You can apply this method if you're an economist and you're looking at econometric data. The same set of ideas can be applied. And the nice thing about this method of going about doing things is that it helps you separate what you think and believe from what actually might be happening. So one of my ground rules in the class is that when I tell you something, I want to make sure that what I'm telling you is based in fact and data. And if you think that I'm ever telling you something that is not based in fact and data, then you can call me on that. And I should be able, because I've prepared for class, I should be able to show you where I got the things that I got, like today, Department of Agriculture data. And that's kind of my agreement with you, is that I'm going to try and be as factually based as I can in this class. But what's the flip side of that?
We have to as well.
You have to as well. Yep, that's it. So we're going to be talking about a lot of issues. A lot of these issues revolve around governmental policy where food is concerned. And so when we talk about these things, I want us to be making the conversations as data-based as we can. We will verge into ethics at times, in which case data doesn't really matter where ethics is concerned, because two people with different ethical perspectives can look at the same data and come to two different conclusions, because not because the data are different between the two people, but because the ethical frameworks that they're using to apply to those data differ. So, any questions about that? I want you, to the best of your ability, to think like a scientist while you're in this class with me. And because you are not scientists, that may become one of the bigger challenges that you have, but hopefully you'll get better at it as we go along. All right, if you'll bear with me for just a few more minutes, I have another example. This one is not so kind to current leadership. So when Donald Trump was running, he was promising to end environmental regulations that kill coal jobs. And so here's a quote from 2017, when he actually signed an executive order to basically reduce a lot of the environmental regulations that regulate coal production and the use of coal in generating electricity. And so here's, once again, another hypothesis. Environmental regulations kill coal jobs. What are the kind of data that we would need in order to get a handle on whether or not this hypothesis was correct? I'll just put them up here as you tell me what they are. What kinds of data do we need to look at?
The conjunction between like the introduction of environmental regulations by governments with trends in the coal market.
Okay, and what specifically about the coal market?
Jobs, employment.
Yeah, coal employment. So are there places where we can get this information in the United States?
Probably.
Oh yeah, there is. Any ideas?
For coal
The
employment?
government website.
Sorry, somebody said something about a website.
I'd say in a governmental website.
Okay, well, does anybody know the branch of government that is responsible for tracking employment?
Department of Labor.
Department of Labor, and specifically within the Department of Labor is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. You're asking yourself, how does an ecology know what the hell the Bureau of Labor Statistics is? Well, when I was an undergraduate, I had a roommate and he was a business major, and his first job when he got out of college was as a statistician at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So I've known about it for a really long time. I didn't have any use for it until just, relatively recently. So you can go onto the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, and they have employment data, and you can divide that employment data up by each of the different kinds of sectors of employment in the United States. Fast food, entertainment. There's a whole energy sector. You can also get the same data from the Energy Information Agency. This is another department in the federal government that tracks energy things. This is now in the Department of Energy. And what's the cool thing about two different people tracking different forms of employment?
It's more factual and less bias. They
I
kind
can
of
go to
check
the
each other.
I can go to the Energy Information Agency and look at their coal jobs numbers, and I can go and look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers on coal employment, and I can see if they match up. And if they do, I'm like, okay, well then I can trust those people, because either they're colluding with one another or they generated data independently and they kind of came to the same answer. I did that. The numbers do match up, but the numbers that I'm going to show you are the Energy Information Agency numbers, because while I was there, they also have a bunch of stuff about the production of coal and other things, the price of coal. And so it was kind of like nice one-stop shopping. What else do we need to know? So the intro regulations thing, the introduction of regulations, who's going to have that information? They've been in the news lately. What's the governmental organization that is involved in environmental protection? Involved in environmental protection.
Conservation?
Conservation actually isn't in the name of the agency. Who was that?
Kinsey?
Oh, hey, Kinsey.
Is it called the EPA?
It is called the EPA. What does EPA stand for?
Environmental Protection Agency.
The Environmental Protection Agency. So you can go onto the Environmental Protection Agency's website and you can get a history of the EPA. And this was the most cumbersome data to generate. And so you can, by scrolling through and reading their history, you can find the dates of when major legislation was passed by Congress that required the EPA to do certain things. And you can also find out when the major regulatory actions of the EPA occurred. So what would you do with these two things once you had them?
You'd overlay.
Yeah, you would overlay them. You would put them in a timeline and look and see what they're doing. And of course, because I have nothing better to do in my spare time, that is exactly what I did, because I'm twisted. So here you have, and I've divided this up by administration. Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, Obama. And so here are all the EPA actions. It's very rare for the EPA to have more than one major regulation in a given year, but the bottom row shows where there was one regulation and the little dots above show where there are 2 regulations. And I limited these 2 regulations that I thought could reasonably be expected to affect coal employment. What do you notice in this graph? Once again, looking at this graph as a scientist.
No trend.
Okay, I'm going to argue with you a little bit there. Why do you say it's no trend?
Well, I assume because with all the regulations being put in place,
Mm-hmm.
the numbers are still fluctuating. Like it's not, unless there's like a really big one that I just don't know which one it was that could have affected it.
Okay, so let's just say that all regulations have kind of an equal effect. There are a lot of regulations during the early 70s and into the late 70s, mainly because the Environmental Protection Agency was just getting kicked up. It was passed in 1970 and the agency formed in 1971. So you don't have anything before that because there wasn't an EPA prior to that. So during that first decade of the EPA, they did a lot. What's happening to coal employment during that time?
Spiking.
It's spiking, it's going up. It's like more regulations leads to more coal employment, which is exactly the opposite of what the hypothesis predicts. Then what do you have in the Reagan administration, Bush 1's administration, and surprisingly enough, this surprised me, during Clinton's administration? I voted for Clinton. I don't know why I voted for Clinton now. A period of low environmental regulation. What's happening to coal employment?
Low employment.
It's going down, strangely enough. And then then that trend stays there until Obama comes on, and Obama started doing a lot of environmental regulation using the EPA. And what happens during Obama's administration?
Going back up.
It goes back up until there's this precipitous decline towards the end of his administration. So in this case, it looks to me like the more environmental regulation you have, the more coal jobs you get. Because during periods of increased regulation, you tend to see increases. And in periods of decreased regulation, you tend to see decreases. So is regulation probably a very good descriptor of the employment data? Somebody's shaking their head no. Who is that?
It's Winston.
Hey, Winston. So you don't think it's probably a very good descriptor. So if it's not a very good descriptor, what might be a better descriptor?
Not sure.
Put on your science thinking caps and think of alternative explanations, alternative hypotheses.
So what you're asking basically, if regulations like aren't a good descriptor, what would be? Is that right?
Or just what's another variable that might be a better explainer of the data?
Okay. Could it be like an availability of coal, maybe? Because if there's not enough coal, why would we need all these people working in an industry that doesn't have a lot of?
So who is that?
It's Winston.
Oh, Winston. Okay, all right. Okay, so if you have a low availability of coal, what should be happening to coal production during this chart?
It should be going down.
Should be going down when there's low employment. It should be going up when there's high employment, right?
Yeah.
Well, the Energy Information Agency, guess what they have on their website? Coal production data. So the black line is coal produced in 1,000 short tons. I'm not in the coal business, so I don't know exactly what a short ton is, but I assume that if you have more of them, you have more coal. What's happening to production as it relates to employment?
Kind of inverse of the data.
So coal production starts kicking off back here in the 1970s. It starts increasing and stays increasing until about 07, and then it starts this precipitous decline. During part of this period, coal production is going up as employment is going up, but then coal production continues to go up as employment is going down. Why on earth might that be happening?
Production gets more efficient. Technological advances mean less people are required for the same amount of production.
Or less people are required for more production even.
Yeah.
So there's possibly a technological explanation for why this graph diverges like this. We're out of time, so your homework between now and Monday is to think about this graph and think about, and maybe even do a little bit of online research, what might have changed about how we extract coal from the ground during this time period that would explain these data going in this direction, because that might have as much to do with trends in coal miner employment than anything else does. On the Moodle site, there are your prompts for the first 2 weeks of food blogging. I am in the process of deleting the old food blogging posts. I started it this morning. It's probably going to take me another couple of hours to get that done. There's one prompt for the first week. You only have to comment on that one prompt once, but I want you to comment on other people's posts twice, and that's in the instructions. And then during the second week, there's a bunch of questions, and you just have to cover those questions over the course of 2 prompts and then 2 responses to other people's posts. I've invited you all to be members, to be authors on the WordPress site, so you should have gotten those in your inbox this morning. So some of you have already accepted the invitation. Those of you who haven't, log on and do that. And do you have any questions?
So as far as like those questions at the beginning, like,
Mm-hmm.
do we email that to you? Is there a Moodle assignment?
No, so the Moodle has the assignment, but you fulfill the assignment on the WordPress in the food blogging.
Okay.
So there's a blogging site that I've set up for you. You've been invited to join it, accept and join, and as soon as you have accepted and joined, you're allowed to write posts and submit posts and just upload them to the site yourself. Once you do that, I and the rest of your classmates can see those posts, and then their task and your task is to respond to one another's posts over the course of the 2 weeks as well.
I think he was asking about like the intro, like with your name and like all that
Oh,
stuff.
yeah.
Where do you
That's
work
not.
on that? Because I have that question as well.
Oh yeah. Just email that to me. Yep. Sorry, I was answering.
Where can we find that?
It is in the first 2 slides, or the second and third slides of the day 1 PowerPoint that is on the Moodle site.
Okay.
So let me get out of this. If you go to the day 1 thing that is from last time, slides 2 and 3 are the things that I want to see from you. So I used to do a note card that I'd take up, but we're not doing that because we're not in the same space. And then I have a set of questions for you to answer. So just get those from the PowerPoint and then put your answers in an email. And a couple of you have already done that, and I appreciate that. So, okay. Other questions? All right. You're out of here then. See you on Monday.
Yeah.
Alyssa, do you have a question?
I don't. I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
I've been
Okay.
in and out of service.
Oh, no. Just I wanted to end the meeting, and I didn't want to cut you off if you had something.
Oh, no, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Bye.